Welcome to the second video clip for this activity, Understanding the Problem. And I suppose it's quite good for us to come at this stage when we've asked you to reflect on how confident do you feel about navigating conversations around race and racism. So this session, hopefully, we will begin to unpack some of the terms around race, racism, looking at the different forms of discrimination, to help you develop just your own understanding of how racism manifests within society generally, and how that links within the teaching profession. So we will continue with the slides. And the very first slide, folks, is really important for us to consider how the Equality Act 2010 discusses race. And within that particular act, race is made reference to one's colour, one's nationality, one's ethnicity, and racial groups that one belongs to. So it's really important to make sure that we clarify that from the very beginning. The second aspect here is about a definition for racism. And for racism, we've drawn from some of the references that you can see within this slide, and really this idea that the assignment of people to an inferior category, and that inferior category determines then how they are being treated from a social, economic, civic and human perspective. Linked to racism is really important for us to consider the roots in terms of colonialism and imperialism. And again, it brings us back to those discussions about decolonising our education system, and really looking at them from a curriculum perspective, a pedagogy perspective, and how racism impacts institutionally across our schools. I've put in here race science, and again, I remember a webinar that I was with Professor Rowena Arshad, and she discusses this aspect, and she recommended that people read Angela Saini's book. And again, we're going to reinforce that here in the sense of her book covers beautifully this aspect of colonialism and the roots to where we find conversations and narratives around racism that really help us to begin to understand power and privilege. I wonder, Yasmin, if you want to come in there to add anything to what I've said.
I certainly do. I certainly do want to talk about having a better understanding of the roots of racism, and I think that's incredibly important across the sector and for all practitioners, simply because in the first instance it creates a greater awareness and a greater consciousness. It also alleviates some of the experiences that minority practitioners experience when they talk about racism and when they talk about the racial prejudice and the racial bias that they experience. In particular, the denial in the first instance, the confusion, whether they've misunderstood the situation, whether they've misunderstood what they've experienced and misunderstood what they have observed, then the dismissal that actually, whilst they may have experienced that, do they want to take it further, especially if they will be accused of perhaps exaggerating, or they will be accused of being motivated by professional gain. Many colleagues have cited that they have this fear that they're playing the race card. And by playing the race card, they will gain by being a victim. There's also the circumstances that many practitioners have cited where the impact of what they've experienced, the impact of the bias and the prejudice that they've experienced is minimised by colleagues. They don't quite understand why it's such a big deal. They can't quite understand the long-term impact of what the victim has experienced, but those who have observed that behaviour and have observed that particular prejudice how they have also been experienced, and the impact that it has on the wider BME community. And therefore, I think it's incredibly important that we understand that by simply, historically, by not acknowledging racism or not understanding racism, we simply cannot understand the current state of play. But we also cannot understand the experiences of those who are experiencing racial discrimination. And therefore, it helps us to become affected by the experiences that affect our colleagues.
There are different forms of racial discrimination, and as you can see in the slide here, I move from the individual, which is often very subtle and covert acts of discrimination. I think very rarely do BME teachers experience overt acts of racism in the workplace. They are often very much those comments that they experience within a staff room, within classrooms, within young people making a comment. And so therefore we need to be very aware of how these manifest within our workplace settings, and be willing to acknowledge and validate that they are indeed experiencing these acts of discrimination. In terms of interpersonal racism, folks, again, it's one group making assumptions about the competency, the motives of other groups based on their race, their ethnicity. And again, that makes reference to this idea of intentional or unintentional actions. And I don't know, I mean, I'm particularly, I'm quite cynical now. I've grown quite cynical about unconscious bias training, Yasmin, in the sense that I often feel that it focuses, or it seems to simplify racism to a certain degree, and tends to focus on the intention of the perpetrator rather than the hurt that it causes the victim. So I'm very mindful of those types of training programs. I mean, sometimes you may have a very, very good effective program, but just mindful of them in the sense of intent or unintentional actions.
It often can leave participants feeling that whilst, yes, we become aware of our prejudices and our biases, many feel actually there's nothing we can do about it. There's an acceptance that we have, that we all have stereotypes that we've formed. We all have particular preferences. We all have prejudices. But there isn't necessarily that acknowledgement that through changing our lived experiences and through acquiring greater knowledge and greater awareness, we can also reduce our biases and our prejudices. And by actually becoming aware of the impact of those prejudices on colleagues, on the decisions that we take, and then the actions that we take, how detrimental it can be, we can actively reshape our biases and our prejudices. And often, many occasions, conversations around unconscious bias are left with those involved in the discussion having a clearer understanding that we all have biases and prejudices, but not necessarily being aware that we can also address our biases and our prejudices and actively reduce them too, and particularly the impact of them.
The internalized racism, Yasmin, is particularly important to discuss here, because again, what we're saying here is in terms of BME teachers, the number of times where they have perhaps experienced microaggressions, any racist incident, oftentimes what they are reporting is that they just learn to accept it. That behaviour has become so normal. And in order to survive, they internalise it and brush it off. This is something that I'm going to have to put up with. And folks, inevitably, that cumulative effect of those microaggressions and that internalised racism eventually gets to a stage where we'll find that our teachers will disengage, that demoralisation kicks in, and then we have real problems with retention, teachers leaving the profession due to racial trauma, that they have experienced over the years. And if they don't leave the profession, then actually that disengagement, Yasmin, that kicks in for many of our BAME teachers because of the constant challenges they face in terms of not just the racism they experience, but the lack of opportunities and access that comes their way.
Internalized racism can be debilitating for BME practitioners because it chips away at your self-esteem. And you go through a process where you start to detach yourself from the outcomes of your work. And for many, it's a coping mechanism, it's perhaps self-protection, where you no longer associate the outcome or the criticism that you're likely to receive regarding your work with self-esteem. But for many, it then results in them not being able to acknowledge positive feedback that they're likely to receive. And it may be positive feedback that they receive from out with their workplace, out with the organisation that they're involved in. However, because they've chosen to disassociate themselves between the feedback that they receive within their workplace and their self-esteem and self-fulfillment, that also results in not being impacted or not being affected in the same way by positive feedback. And I've often spoken to BME colleagues who have commented that perhaps because I'm so accustomed to frequent criticism and my work being undervalued and undermined, it's almost as if I don't know how to react anymore to positive feedback, or I just don't react at all. And some have even commented, my white colleagues don't behave that way. They actually celebrate that positive feedback, and they celebrate it very freely and very openly. I don't do that. And therefore, there's a long-term impact on one's self-esteem, on the behaviours that you adopt in order to protect yourself.
And institutional racism here, folks, within a school setting, it is exactly this, where results of, as a result of procedures and policies that actually go that are against certain groups of people. So thinking about our policies within schools, how relevant are they for our BME young people who are part of that school community? How relevant are they for our BME teachers within the workforce? We need to be thinking about policies and processes that are fit for purpose, that actually acknowledge the experiences of our diverse communities, and that they are able to relate to those policies and processes within our schools. That's really important, because oftentimes, Yasmin, it goes back to where our BME teachers say that they don't recognise themselves in some of the processes within schools, or that invisibility is there when you're thinking about, say, for example, producing a policy on the language, English language, teaching English language in the school, or supporting bilingual learners policy. Do we actually have those types of policies within our school settings? Do we have a race equality statement that perhaps acknowledges those experiences and sets out clearly procedures about behaviour, about workplace culture and ethos that support, and perhaps also reporting and supporting processes? So where a young person or a staff member experiences a racist incident, what should they be doing? What processes do they need to take in order to be supported through that?
When we think about different forms of racism, for many, the assumption can be that it's easily identifiable. And for many colleagues, it simply isn't. It can be constantly being undermined in a meeting. It can be constantly overlooked with respect to even being encouraged to provide input. It could be presenting a proposal and having it completely dismissed in many ways, until another colleague in the same meeting makes the same suggestion, and then it's very much a serious consideration. And therefore, in our everyday professional lives, with different forms of discrimination that BME colleagues are likely to face, is varied. It's not uniform. And two BME colleagues are not likely to have the same experiences. That makes it incredibly difficult to evidence in the first instance, and it makes it incredibly difficult to then talk about and to explain. However, microaggressions is a term that many may not be familiar with, but certainly with respect to the behaviours that are involved that would define microaggressions and the impact that it has, many BME colleagues will certainly relate to it. And whether it's intentional or unintentional behaviour, folks, I think we need to get past the intent and we need to focus more on the impact that it has on those who are affected. And therefore, it's about any negative conduct that has an impact on a racial minority. And that can be body language, it can be use of language, it can be policies and processes that are perhaps implemented in a way that suggests an unfairness and an inequity. But aggressions manifest themselves in organisations and workplaces in many different ways, and it's very much about becoming more comfortable talking about them and acknowledging them. Now, the importance of having discussions about racial discrimination and the impact that racial discrimination can have on colleagues, those discussions must take into account that BME professionals, the BME community, is not a homogenous group. And on many occasions, as a support organisation, when we're working with other support organisations and we're working with other BME professionals, we are also aware that BME-led organisations can also work in a very mutually exclusive way, where many of us focus on a particular protected characteristic. However, we can perhaps lose sight that for many BME practitioners, they will be affected by multiple protected characteristics, and therefore that will heighten the discrimination that they face. And therefore, for someone from the BME community, but also with a disability, someone from the BME community who also is part of the LGBT community, they may face multiple forms of discrimination, and the discrimination that's experienced may be more aggressive. And therefore, as a wider community, what we must take account of is that the policies, the practices that we discuss cannot be mutually exclusive. We simply cannot allow for one particular protected characteristic to fall off the agenda. And when we do talk about racial equality, we must talk about racial equality in the context of racial equality that intersects with other protected characteristics. We must also be mindful that within a racial group, the experiences of BME practitioners will not be the same. And for many BME practitioners, they have commented on the discrimination that they experience within minority communities, either because they have a fairer skin colour, and on that basis, they're perhaps not considered as an ethnic minority, or they often cite that as far as any conversations centred around discrimination, they simply aren't given the same platform. And for others, they have commented that the darker your skin colour, the more aggressive forms of discrimination you're likely to experience. Therefore, we are not a homogenous group and our experiences vary considerably. With respect to institutional racism that we're likely to encounter within our workspaces, certainly the most obvious will be the approaches that have been adopted with respect to professional development and the progression of BME colleagues. If we take into account social role theory, then stereotypes have very much emerged from the observations of individuals. And those observations are very much in professional settings and social settings, and therefore we're very much influenced throughout our lives. We're very much influenced by those who we see in particular roles. So at this point, as we've set the scene and we're aware of the current state of play, we're very aware that there is little representation, ethnic representation in leadership roles in the education sector. And therefore that has an influence. It impacts the expectations that are associated with respect to a particular professional community and the expectations with respect to particular professional positions within the education sector. And at this point, we must question, are white leaders in the education sector, are they able to see our BME practitioners in leadership roles at this time? Do they value the skills, the attributes and the competencies that they have? And do they associate that skill set with leadership traits? Now, those leadership traits may well be based on stereotypes and romanticized notions of what leaders should be like and how leaders should behave. That's not necessarily effective leadership. It's simply what we've become accustomed to. So what assumptions then on that basis, what assumptions are made about BME teachers? Well, we certainly are aware, and the conversations that we've had, Khadija and I have had with BME practitioners and across the sector, we certainly seem to have an agreement that BME teachers aren't underrepresented because they lack the skill set or they lack the competencies. It's simply that they lack access. It's about limited opportunities. It's about those visible and invisible barriers. And as a result of the disproportionate representation of BME practitioners in promoted posts in leadership roles, it suggests that stereotypes are strengthening with respect to the qualities that are expected in leaders in the education sector and the qualities and the competencies that BME practitioners demonstrate. And therefore it would suggest that this is an appropriate time, especially as the education sector is changing in many ways. It's changing with respect to the way it delivers its curriculum. It's reviewing the content of the curriculum. And it's very much focusing on encouraging diversity in the workforce. It would suggest that this is an appropriate time to address institutional racism, and particularly in the context of that disparity, the disparity between the characteristics that many of us, including the BME community, have associated with leadership, and the characteristics that we associate with effective leadership that are genuinely required, that are actually required on the ground to deliver leadership. It's starting to recognise leadership in many different forms. And certainly the conversations that we have with BME teachers, that proves to be a challenge, especially if leadership qualities are not recognised through performance reviews, through any discussions with respect to professional development, and therefore we must at this point question or discuss the progression and promotion policies and processes and practices that we have across the education sector and how inclusive they are.
So we have a couple of questions for you to reflect on, and by way of providing a couple of case studies. And so the very first case study, as you can see here, is from a BME female member of staff who talks about her frustration about social events. And I don't need to read this out to you, as you can see on the screen yourself here, but it's about that social exclusion that Lubna is facing here. And really the question here is, how would you advise Lubna if she approached you? I think the big message, Yasmin, is that message of solidarity to BME colleagues, that they're not actually, this is not something that's in their heads. It's not their problem, which is often the message that's communicated to them, because you are, say, for example, from a Muslim background, and for that reason, well, if you can't come to the pub, you can't come to the pub. Or perhaps it could be a health issue, Yasmin. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious issue. Somebody feels uncomfortable. But on this occasion, this particular teacher is saying, I'm comfortable going, but actually the last time I went, I experienced racial abuse, and so therefore no longer want to find myself visiting a setting where I'm exposed in that way. And I think the bigger aspect here is that when we are thinking about social events for staff and students, or for our young people, in many ways, we need to be thinking about them being racially inclusive spaces, and religiously inclusive spaces as well. It's so important for us to think about that. And there are many other places, Yasmin, where I think colleagues can get together that takes away from that pub environment, so where colleagues can still enjoy having a drink, but perhaps it's in a better setting where their colleague will not be exposed to any kind of racist incidents. Whether it's that going to perhaps a hotel, whether it's perhaps arranging to meet at a certain time, so perhaps colleagues can either first meet to have dinner together and then go off to support each other in a pub setting. And so therefore you have a choice to say, well, actually, I'll meet you for the meeting, the dinner, and I'll not meet you for the event afterwards, or the other way around.
I guess it's about having a more holistic approach to team building in the first instance, because colleagues have often mentioned that this is an opportunity for you to get to know your colleagues better out with the work environment. It can actually be a real bonding experience as well, because let's face it, it gives you an opportunity to have a rant about the workplace too, and that can be quite cathartic. However, if you're not part of that discussion, and if you're not part of that relationship building and team building, you become isolated. And whilst we have made reference to an activity that is considered a social activity, it has a direct impact on your professional life. On the level of professional isolation that you're likely to feel, how much you feel that you have a sense of belonging, you feel that you're very much part of the team, that affinity that you have with your colleagues, and building that relationship of trust. And many colleagues from across sectors have commented about moving away from the bar culture. On many occasions, colleagues have mentioned that we really do need to get away from that, because not everyone is in a position to and chooses to drink alcohol. And therefore, we must come up with other alternatives. For some, they have childcare commitments that suggest that actually they simply can't. For others, it's for religious reasons. But it's about inclusive workplace practices, and those workplace practices extend to colleagues out with the physical workspace. And therefore, this particular example, whilst it is in a social context, it's about understanding the holistic aspect of building those relationships with colleagues. It extends way beyond the physical workspace. It has consequences, and it has an impact in the physical workspace then.